Okay. Hi, YouTube folks, and Instagram folks. I hit the wrong button, so that instead of going live, I did a scheduling thing. Anyway, we'll see who shows up. I am Larry Harnisch. This is Boxie. Boxie is the Los Angeles County District Attorney's files in the Black Dahlia case. And this is my monthly Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel, and the Black Dahlia. Uh, Only George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions. I do another Ask Me Anything on the Black Dahlia case the first Tuesday of the month. In this case, it will be November 5th, which is election day. Go ahead and be sure to vote. But yeah, anyway, that is the plan. And let's see. Okay. First thing first. Halloween's coming up. Don't dress up like the Black Dahlia for Halloween. Don't do it. No, don't do it. Just know that there is no way that you can, whatever people are trying to do in dressing up like Elizabeth Short, whether it's honoring her memory or whatever, or being weird and gross, there are better ways even to be weird and gross than dressing up like Elizabeth Short. So, okay. Let's see. Anyway, yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen with YouTube since I hit the wrong button and had to start another live stream. So I don't know how that's going to turn out. We'll see. Anyway, but this is the monthly Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel, and I started doing these a while back because I got fed up with the caliber of true crime podcasts and TV shows and that kind of thing. I just decided to start doing my own, and that's why I am doing these. If you are new, I have been fact checking Steve Hodel for 21 years since publication of Black Dahlia Venture. Okay, that's when I started, and I will tell you now, Steve Hodel lies. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. He is a 24/7 bullshit factory. The average person who doesn't know anything about the history of law enforcement, the Black Dahlia case, the medical profession, how the jury system works, how the court system works, the art world, the medical profession. If you don't know anything about that, you cannot imagine how much he has made up. It's staggering. It really is. Anyway, so that's kind of the proviso on that. Now, you might have seen, and the way this works is I will talk for a little bit and then I'll open it to questions, although I'm not getting anybody on YouTube, so I don't know if I'm even going to get any questions. We'll find out, maybe. Anyway, so the first thing I want to talk about is and I'm going to get in. First of all, I'm going to talk about Steve, and then I'm going to talk about Michael Connelly and the waiting. Okay. So, spoiler alert, if you are a Michael Connelly fan, if you have not read The Waiting yet or are looking forward to it, I am good. Just a little bit. I'm going to talk more about it next week, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it today. So, first of all, Steve got some ink. He got some attention. Let me see if anybody's over here on chat. Hang on a second. Sorry. Okay. There we go. Okay. So Steve got a little ink in the supermarket press. It was kind of the news peg, as we call it in the news business, is a series on Zodiac. And so the I lost my notes here. The news peg was retired homicide detective believes his dad was Zodiac. Now, I'm not a Zodiac person. Okay. I'm a specialist, not a generalist. I don't know. I mean, I know basically about Zodiac, but beyond that, no. Anyway, but the simple answer is was George Hodel Zodiac? No, he wasn't, for many, many, many reasons, including and correct me if I'm wrong here, please. But my understanding of Zodiac is that most of his victims were shot. Not all, but most of them were shot. And was Elizabeth Short shot? No. Was any of the other murders that he attributes to his dad in Los Angeles, were any of those victims shot? No, they were not. No. And Steve, as an investigator, really doesn't lay the groundwork to prove that his dad was in San Francisco at the time of Zodiac. At that point, George Hodel was living in the Philippines, and he was in business, so he did fly somewhat. But I mean, Steve will have his dad being traveling all over the world, committing famous unsolved murders. Well, no. And I do know a little bit about the ciphers and whatnot that were used in Zodiac. I have kind of played with them a little bit, and Steve has the idea that every letter sent to the police taunting the police, they're all from his dad, and his proof of that is either, number one, he recognizes his dad's handwriting, no, or he has this thing he calls a thought print, and the thought print is an investigative tool that only Steve Hodel can use, and it only works with George Hodel. So it's kind of limited. That's a good question. I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, so no, all of the underlying groundwork that you would have to do to establish that George Hodel was Zodiac, no, he hasn't done any of that. It would be preposterous, and I'm kind of tough on Steve, but not nearly. The Zodiac people are brutal on Steve, and I will kind of leave the rebuttal to them, except to say, no, George Hodel was not Zodiac. Go away with that, and leave it at that. The other thing I want to talk about before I open it up to questions is the waiting. Okay. This is, if you are a Michael Connelly fan, this is Michael Connelly's latest book. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. Spoiler. Okay. If you are a Michael Connelly fan, if you haven't read this book yet and you don't want it spoiled, stop watching now. Okay. Mike kind of smushes a couple of cases together. What he does in this is again, spoiler alert, he takes some elements of the Black Dahlia Elizabeth Short case and then smushes them together with Harvey Glattman. Who was Harvey Glattman? Harvey Glattman was a guy who presented himself as a photographer. He was a little bit later. He was in the 50s. And his whole shtick was that he would hire models. And this was in the day when detective magazines would feature women, fearful, tied up, that kind of thing on the cover of the detective magazines. And so that was Harvey Glattman's thing. He would hire these models, pretend to be a photographer, tie up these models on the pretense of that they were posing for photos, and then he would strangle them. And he killed a couple of women like that. And so that's kind of where that's kind of what Mike does in The Waiting. The unusual thing is that Mike brings in Black Dahlia Avenger. Okay. Now, Black Dahlia Avenger is not George Hodel. It's this photographer who is, it's a Harvey Glattman type individual, where the photographer is killing people, but he's got his killer writing BDA on various victims and that kind of thing. The reality, which is where we live, is that Black Dahlia Avenger was a prank. Okay, the whole thing was a prank. It wasn't real. It was just a prank from day one, and whoever pulled it has got to be laughing their tail off that anybody is taking it seriously. It was a prank. It was a joke on the cops from day one. That's the reality. So that's kind of the deal with Black Dahlia Avenger. Anyway, I'll have a lot more to say about Mike Connelly and the waiting and the treatment of the Black Dahlia case next Tuesday, which is election day. Be sure to vote. But in the morning, about 10 o'clock Pacific time, I'll be doing my monthly Black Dahlia talk, and I will discuss this in a lot more detail then. So with that, let's take some questions. I got one over here on Instagram. Do I think that George Hodel committed any crimes? No. As far as I am concerned, George Hodel never killed anybody. It is a total scam by Steve Hodel that was then picked up by other members of the Hodel family, and we're at the point where lying about George Hodel is the family business. What happened was Steve writes Black Dahlia Avenger in total secrecy, and then his half sister, Fauna. No, wait a minute, half sister. No, his niece, I think. Pardon me. It's hard to keep the Hodel family tree straight. Anyway, Fauna Hodel has written a book, and she had an interesting life. But she writes the book, but she incorporates all of the Black Dahlia Avenger stuff into her biography. And then subsequently, her daughters have, oh yeah, we knew great grandpa was no. It is all a scam from day one. No. Okay, I'm going to have to go back here on Instagram. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Steve Hodel in Black Dahlia Avenger, he pulled out these photographs from his dad. He said, "Oh, I found these photographs in my dad's stuff that are Elizabeth Short." No, they're not. No, they're not. No. And but people fall for that, and it has been interesting to discover that, given the choice between a lying cop, not all cops lie, but when they do, you can't stop them. The choice between a lying cop and a truthful journalist there's no match. The lying cop will win every time. And what's interesting about Steve is, if you watch the video that goes with his little thing on Zodiac, the victim is not Elizabeth Short. It's not the people who were killed by Zodiac. It isn't anybody else. The victim in Steve's saga, his life story, that's him. Steve Hodel is the victim. Oh, I discovered this horrible thing, and oh, I discovered this horrible thing, and I went through all these emotions and all this stuff. So Steve has made the Black Dahlia case and Zodiac and all of that. He made it about himself. It's really a remarkable achievement. But Steve, at least in his telling, is the victim. So it's pretty impressive. Okay, let's see. I find the concept of linking various serial killers as one very odious and terrible. Yeah, it's, and I say this repeatedly, so I am repeating myself, but one thing I've learned is that unsolved murders exert a tremendous magnetism on one another in the public imagination. People will say, "Oh, this is just like this. This is just like this killing is just like this killing." It's like, no, they're not. They're totally different. But in the public imagination, all the contradicting details disappear, and so it becomes this sort of chain or series of killings by this maniacal killer who is a criminal genius and one step ahead of the police when they are different, unrelated cases. So let's go over here. Okay, why do some want to believe George Hodel murdered Elizabeth Short? Um, I think to me, a bad answer is better than no answer. People find it very difficult to accept we don't know. That's hard for people. People want an answer. And so what happens is some people are willing to believe like a bad answer better than no answer. That hole, that negative space of not knowing who did it is unacceptable. People need an answer no matter how ridiculous it is. And with George Hodel, it doesn't matter how much evidence you throw at people. Um, they hang on to that. I mean, I could say indefinitely, no, he wasn't a surgeon. No, his clientele were poor blacks living in segregated Los Angeles. They were not the wealthy bully. They were not the wealthy elite. Um, his clientele was not, he wasn't a mover and shaker. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't throw elaborate cocktail parties with a who's who of Hollywood. None of that stuff is true. Steve doesn't remember living he will say, well, I remember living in the Soudan house. And we know, no, Steve, you didn't live in the Soudan house. Your parents were divorced and you were living with your mother. But that doesn't matter. You can throw all this evidence, boom, 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 boom. And they lock onto that and they live in a logic tight compartment and you can't penetrate that. Um, People will say, oh, no, well, okay, I don't think George Hodel was Zodiac, but I'm pretty sure he killed, it's like, well, if Steve is wrong about Zodiac, how does he suddenly become right about the Black Dahlia? No, he doesn't. It's all of a pattern. It's all made up. Um, he was never suspected of killing his secretary. The secretary committed suicide. Steve will say, oh, yeah. Um, oh, he was, and he'll say, it's in here. No, it's not. No, it's not. He was never suspected of killing his secretary. She committed suicide. But that doesn't matter. That does not stick in the world of Steve Hodel. Um, okay, let's see. Do I know if Steve is still planning to write another book about his father being the Black Dahlia Kiever, even though he's been exposed? Oh yeah. I mean, here's my take on Steve. Steve has written Black Dahlia Avenger 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Black Dahlia Avenger meets Son of Frankenstein. He's written a play. He's written his last book is like this fantasy of a trial. Steve will be writing books until he takes a dirt nap. And why is that? Steve needs the attention. Steve is like a junkie. He is hooked on Steve is hooked on the adulation, the book signings, the public appearances, and so he will keep writing, and he will keep writing books, and he knows his case is weak, so he has to keep finding more evidence. And he has a couple of enablers who come along and do his research for him. Steve is not great with details at all. And so he will have people sort of help him along. Okay. Let me take one of my submitted questions here. Okay. I just read a post by Steve Hodel highlighting what he calls the Ray Bradbury George Hodel synchronicity. He writes, what I find fascinating is how 3 separate Hodel connections would all connect to this respected novelist. Steve cites 1948, Bradbury writes a short story based on the 1946 Chicago lipstick serial killing. Jean French, both committed by George Hodel, no. And then Ray Bradbury's hired by John Huston to write the Moby Dick screenplay. And then Bradbury meets and does extensive sci-fi television interview with Mike Hodel. Okay, and Bradbury meets and co-hosts a literary luncheon with fellow writer Steve Hodel. Okay, I think this is just name dropping. Let's talk about Ray Bradbury for a minute. Ray Bradbury was a very prolific author. He was And I can tell you about my Ray Bradbury connections. I lived in Tucson, Arizona. Ray Bradbury lived in Tucson, Arizona. I lived in Los Angeles. Ray Bradbury lived in Los Angeles. Okay. So there you, there you have it. But to be serious for a minute, okay. Ray Bradbury was an extremely prolific writer. 1948 is very, very early in his career. I couldn't find a copy of the actual story. What I did find was a radio show. There was a radio program called Suspense in the 1940s. Remember, this is before television. And so there was a radio program called Suspense, and they just burned through stories. And so Ray Bradbury's story, and I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, but anyway, it was adapted for this radio show, and I listened to half of it. Remember, the radio shows were preserved on transcription discs, and the second disc is missing, so there's only the first half of the show. But I listened to that, and it's boring. I have to say, it is really dull. It's like, but what that show is about is it's a love triangle. Okay. Two women are in love with one guy. One of the women in the radio show Suspense is played by Ida Lupino. Okay. So the setup is that these two women are vying for this guy. And so one of the women, played by arranges, kills her rival and makes it look like this serial killer who is rampaging the local town. Okay. And then it turns out that the guy she's interested in is actually the serial killer. Okay. Does any of that sound like what happened to Suzanne Degnan? No. Does that sound at all like what happened to Jean French? No, it has absolutely zero similarity at all. I mean, come on, but Steve is not someone who embraces research like I do. He's not good at that. Okay, let's talk about Moby Dick and John Huston. Okay. Ray Bradbury had a thing about Moby Dick. He also wrote an opera based on Moby Dick. It's called Leviathan. And I have a copy of the script, the libretto for Ray Bradbury's opera, Leviathan, which has never been done. It has never been composed. He was trying to get Arizona Opera Company, which I covered once upon a time when I was a reporter in Arizona. I covered Arizona Opera. So I happened to come in possession of Ray Bradbury's script for Leviathan based on Moby Dick. And it's like, okay, it's like, fine, John Huston and Ray Bradbury write a screenplay. Okay, fine. Ray Bradbury is interviewed by Steve's older brother, Mike. Well, Mike Hodel is a radio host. He interviews lots of people, and Ray Bradbury was very approachable. He gave interviews to everybody. It's like, So to me, it's just name dropping, and that's really the extent of it. I don't see anything beyond that. Okay, let me go over to Instagram here. What about the rape of the daughter? Okay, what this question is on Instagram is, what about the trial of George Hodel on allegations of his daughter Tamar? Now, I did a whole video about the trial of George Hodel, so that's kind of the answer there. It's on YouTube, and I think it's on Instagram, but let me cover it briefly. Tamar was a problem child from the get-go. She was an incorrigible teenager. She had been a prolific liar since the age of 7. Her mother testified in court during the trial of George Hodel that she had been taking Tamar to see a psychiatrist since the age of 7 because she was a liar. Tamar was an incorrigible girl, and the mom finally sent her off to a convent to try to get her to behave. That didn't work. And what happened eventually was that the mom had a heart attack. I believe, I'm relying on my memory here, which is always risky, but I believe the mom had a heart attack and said, Tamar, I've had it with you. You make up all these stories about everybody molesting you. And that was Tamar's go-to thing, was she was constantly accusing men of molesting her. So the mom says, I am shipping you down to your dad in Los Angeles. Okay. And so George is divorced at this point. He's living the single bachelor life in the Souden house. He doesn't want this incorrigible teenage daughter. And she's from the Bay Area. She's from San Francisco. She doesn't want to live with dad down in Los Angeles. How could this possibly go right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong here, right? So Tamar comes to live with George. She goes to Hollywood High School and runs away from home as incorrigible. If you've ever dealt with an incorrigible teenage girl, one of the things they do is, guess what? They run away from home. Anyway, so she accuses George and Steve always leaves this out, 19 boys at Hollywood High School of molesting her. 19. I thought it was, I was saying it was 13. It was actually 19 in one news account. So Tamar makes these allegations against George, and all of these boys at Hollywood High School, who are all interviewed, they're all eliminated. And the district attorney had just come up with a team to handle like juveniles, and they had just successfully prosecuted an incest case. It was the matter of it was a tennis coach who was molesting his daughter, and he went to prison. The guy actually did go to prison, and so this followed up on that. Now, Tamar, before she got sent down to Los Angeles, tells her older half-brother, Duncan. Remember, there's lots of Hodel kids, lots of wives. It's hard to keep them all straight. Anyway, from marriage number one, there is this son called Duncan. And Tamar tells Duncan, I don't want to go down to Los Angeles. I am going to tell the cops that dad molested me. It won't be true, but the cops won't know that, and I'll get him in trouble. How do we know that? Because that came out during the trial of George Hodel. And so what happens is they bring charges against George, and there is a trial. And let me point out that the jury consisted of either 8 women and 4 men, or 9 women and 3 men. The accounts vary. But anyway, in general, it was a majority female jury. It's not like you see in I Am the Night where all the jurors are laughing around. The jury was mostly women. None of them believed Tamar. And there was a slew of witnesses for George Hodel. Not just Duncan. There was also the grandmother. Tamar's grandmother showed up. We wouldn't believe Tamar under oath. The mom says we wouldn't believe Tamar under oath. There is roughly, I think it was something like 10 women who had known Tamar as a girl. They all said exactly the same thing. We would not believe her even under oath. She is a pathological liar. And so the upshot of that was George Hodel was found not guilty by this jury. Again, let me stress, 8 women and 4 men, or 9 women and 3 men, one or the other. Anyway, he was found not guilty. And Steve will tell you, oh, well, dad, paid off. Well, who are you going to pay off? You can't pay off a jury. Let's get real. But a payoff was involved in corruption, and it was a real life LA Confidential. And then, dad was about to get arrested in the Black Dahlia case, and he fled the country. No, the reality was that even though George Hodel was found not guilty, his reputation was so trashed from this trial that he couldn't get a job anywhere. Nobody would hire him. He had to go all the way to Hawaii, which was an American territory at that point, to get a job. And Steve will say, well, and the reality, which is where we live, is George Hodel was not the prime suspect. He was under He was under police surveillance. They bugged his house for 5.5 weeks, and they eliminated him as a suspect. There's no there. Um, if the LAPD had wanted George Hodel, they could have very easily extradited him from Hawaii. And Steve knows that. Steve was a cop. He knows how extraditions work. If they had wanted him, they could have gotten him. They didn't want him. It's that simple. No, they didn't want him. They were done with him. So that's kind of the long story about the trial of George Hodel and Tamar and all that stuff. Okay. Let's see. What happened between you and Elroy? Jason, that is not a George Hodel question. So I will tell you what I can say is that, let's see. What I can say is that Elroy embraced, Elroy originally was F.U. Steve Hodel because Steve claims that in Black Dahlia Avenger that George Hodel kills Elroy's mom. And so Elroy was originally F.U. Steve Hodel. And then Elroy comes along and writes the introduction to Black Dahlia Avenger, the paperback version. So that was kind of the end of me and James Elroy. Later on, Elroy had a falling out with Hodel, and now he says now Elroy refuses to talk about me, the Black Dahlia case, Steve Hodel. He won't, and I think his mom's murder. He won't talk about any of them. So that's kind of that. Let's see. Okay, when George, I don't smoke. No, he's talking about cigarettes there at that point. What Republican One is talking about is in the recordings. George Hodel's house was bugged for 5.5 weeks, and what we know is that George Hodel knew he was under surveillance. How can we be so sure? Well, he says in the transcripts, which I have posted online, lamirror.com, George Hodel says, "They're out to get me." Oh, so he knows. Then he says, "The men from the telephone company were here." Oh, really? The men from the telephone company. And you can see in the transcripts where he says, he's looking for the microphones. He says it must be around here someplace. So he's looking for the microphones. And as soon as he finds the microphones, he starts shooting off his mouth about the Black Dahlia. That's when it happens. That's when he says, "Supposing I killed the Black Dahlia," blah, blah, blah. That's all after he finds the microphones. The investigation was compromised from day one. And that's the short answer on that. So anything that's on the transcripts, George Hodel said, knowing that he knew that the cops were listening, and that was that. Has Steve ever responded? No. In Steve's mind, Steve believes it, and that is it. Don't bother him with pesky details. Blah blah blah. Okay. I can see that I'm going to have to invest in a ring light one of these days. Sorry about that. Let's see. I've got one more. Oh, this is interesting. Anyway, no, George Hodel didn't smoke pot. No, none of that. None of that's true. He's talking about cigarettes. No, he's just talking about regular old cigarettes, not weed. No, I mean, the classic example of how Steve, he will cherry pick the quotes and he will distort them incredibly. And the best example of that is where he says, what happens is they're doing a wire recording of the bug of Steve Hodel's house. They're doing a bug of George Hodel's house, and they have a wire recorder. It's not tape. As many times as Steve says it's tape, it's not tape. It's wire. Okay, it's a wire recorder. And one of the technicians says, "I had trouble with one reel." Okay. Steve will transform that into his dad saying, "I'm in trouble." So no, His dad doesn't say I'm in trouble. It's the technician saying he's having trouble with the equipment. But Steve is just shameless. He will have his dad saying I'm in trouble. No, not true. Okay, submitted question here. In 1935, famed Polish-born German surrealist photographer Hans Bellmer, not Man Ray, as that idiot Hodel claims, although they were intimate colleagues within the French surrealist circle, produced a series of very influential photographs of dissected mannequins. They are part of an elaborate series called The Doll, La Poupée. Here is the link to one of the Art Institute of Chicago's exhibit website from 1935 that reminds us a lot of Elizabeth Short's corpse. Here's a different one from 1933. As you will immediately notice, there is an undeniable similarity, perhaps purely coincidental, between the artwork and the way Short's body was found, both in terms of vivisection and posed. Okay, no. Is there an undeniable similarity? Yeah, I'll deny it. No, I've looked at the photographs, and no, it is not at. I mean, it is not at all reminiscent of what was done to Elizabeth Short. No, it isn't. And I think that this is my very long. They left the microphones there. Yeah, I don't think they ever came back and got them. I don't think so. Anyway, the way human beings process information is the example I like to use is the nighttime sky. The nighttime sky is full of pinpoints of light, stars, right? And so what do humans do? We say they make a pattern, they make a picture. They're the Big Dipper, they're the Little Dipper, they're Orion's belt. Okay, no, these are just random points of light, but it is how human beings process information. Okay, that's how we as human beings process information. So what we do is we see patterns where there really aren't any. It's just kind of random. And we like to see this was inspired by this, such and such is inspired by that. And it's like, no. So did whoever killed Elizabeth Short see these pictures? No. Of the dolls? No, not at all. And the bisection of Elizabeth Short is really a minor point of everything that was done to her. People focus on that, but so much else was done to her that it's really, it is as horrendous as it is. That was just to make her body easy to transport. So I don't see any similarity. I don't see any connection at all. And the other part of this question is the fecal material found inside Miss Short's stomach during the autopsy. How did it get there? Hodel claims his father had manure and cement at the house for landscaping, and that Short was force-fed manure with grass particulate in it. Okay, where does that come from? Okay, the Elizabeth Short had was forced to eat feces. That comes from a book called Severed by John Gilmore. The medical examiner's report says her stomach had feces in it. Yes, that's what happens to food when it breaks down. It was a combination of food breaking down through digestion and then backflow from her being cut in half. And it's that simple. Was she forced to eat feces? No, that is strictly an invention of John Gilmore that Steve has just appropriated. Steve does a lot of that. There was a guy who claimed that, this will sound familiar. There was a guy who claimed that Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton Avenue as a pointer to Degnan, which is a couple of blocks away. And I don't. His actual website. He's dead. His website is defunct, but it's now that the URL, the address is now malware, and so I don't tell anybody what the address is. Anyway, this guy came up with that idea, and of course Steve just stole it without acknowledging it. And he originally was saying, "Oh yes, well, Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton as a pointer. He's gotten to the point where he says her body was left off Degnan. He won't even say it was on Norton, which is what's at. He'll say, "Oh, Elizabeth Short's body was left off Degnan." No, no. You cannot imagine. You really can't imagine, unless you know the case very, very well. You can't imagine how much he has made up and faked things and distorted things. It's staggering. It is absolutely staggering. Anyway, why George Hodel raping his daughter is supposed to be an important argument in favor of his alleged. Yeah, those two crimes don't seem similar at all. No, it's just my basic take. And if you read between the lines here in Black Dahlia Avenger, it's pretty evident that all the Hodel kids, and remember, there are a lot of George Hodel. Hodel had a lot of kids. They all thought Dad was really wealthy, and when he died, he was going to leave them a lot of money, and he didn't. And so they kind of cashed in. They decided to cash in on Dad to sell books, and so really, that's the motivation of it, is just to cash in on conveniently dead Dad, and that's really all it's about. Let's see. No, Steve has actually had he's been offered the opportunity to debate me, and he won't do it. Somebody asked me, how about a debate between you and Steve Hodel? And I originally said no, and I thought, well, okay, but he won't do it. So let's see. Yeah, that's how could George Hodel kill Elizabeth Short in a house full of people? Well, Steve has a good answer for that. So, well, we were, because Steve will say he was living at the Soudan house. No, he wasn't. Anything is possible in the parallel reality of Steve Hodel. His dad had this surgical suite in the basement and killed all these people, was doing all this horrible stuff to Elizabeth Short. And it's a fantasy. It really is at this point. Just this, Steve has created this parallel reality where his father is this America's most prolific serial killer traveling around the world committing famous unsolved murders. None of it's true. Not at all. Chat GPT, yeah. You lost me at Chat GPT. I'm done. What's known about George Hodel, Manal, and Sigmund Freud? Anything? Manal, I think you mean Man Ray. Sigmund Freud, not at all. Okay. Let me take a running start at the question about the Soudan house. Okay. The Soudan house was a rental, and Steve will say, yeah, Dad bought the Soudan house. Okay, no. The Soudan house, as best as I can determine, was a rental. It had been a rental for a long time. George Hodel Sr. had been a real estate speculator. Dad was wealthy. George Sr. was a wealthy guy. And so he bought and sold real estate and that kind of thing. And the Soudan house had been a theater company. It had been a voice studio. A guy had it, and he rented rooms to his voice students, that sort of thing. So it was a theater company was in there for a long time. I mean, it was just whoever showed up and paid the rent, they got the Soudan house. And so George finally shows up, and I think George Jr., Steve's dad, kind of took advantage of the similarity between George Sr. and George Jr. George Jr. Put up the Soudan house as collateral to pay for his defense and that kind of thing. But I think I think it was really owned by George Sr. The interesting thing is, there are for George Hodel to buy the Soudan house, it has to be for sale, right? That makes sense. You can't find any real estate ads for the Soudan house. The most recent one was in the 30s someplace. It was never offered for sale. It was never listed in any newspaper. as being for sale. I mean, you can't buy a house. I mean, it seems fundamental, right? You can't buy a house that isn't for sale, right? So, but that's not the kind of thing that stops Steve Hodel. No. So that's kind of that is kind of the answer is George Jr. put up the house as collateral, and I don't know if he got the money from his dad in the long run or not. Okay, you can't. Steve's claims are liable liable for damages. You can't libel a dead person, and so every time Steve libels somebody who's dead, like his dad or Fred Sexton or any of these other people, if they're dead, you can't libel them, and so that's why he is, and that's why he is safe. Is there a way for us to fact check what we read about Elizabeth? Yes, there is. I strongly recommend. Don't read any of the books. People want to. What's the best book on the Black Dahlia case? None of them. None. But if you want to fact check Steve, I highly recommend that you go to the original news accounts. At this point, they're all online. If you have newspapers.com, newspapers.com has the Los Angeles Times and the Daily News. They are both online with Black Dahlia coverage. That's online. If you don't have a subscription to newspapers.com, you can get it probably through your library. Public libraries also have, I think, Access newspapers or something like that. And even if you can't, the wire services picked up some of the coverage. But if you can read the Daily News coverage of the trial of George Hodel, it's pretty good. And I would recommend that really even over the Herald Express and the Examiner, which are also online, the two Hearst papers. Those are online, not through newspapers.com, but through Genealogy Bank. So all the local newspapers for the trial of George Hodel, they're all online. And the same thing is true if you want to fact check Steve on what he says about Elizabeth Short. All of those newspaper articles are online in the original newspapers. Don't read the books. The books are full of mistakes and fiction. Go back to the original news accounts from January 1947 to about March. That'll give you a working knowledge. The FBI file is online, but if you don't already know the case really, really well, you're going to get lost reading the FBI file. Unless you have the strength to only read the newspaper articles in the FBI file and don't read anything else. Don't read all the memos and all the other stuff, the interviews. Just ignore all of that and read and read the newspaper articles in the FBI file. If you can control yourself to do that, then you'll be okay. Boxie here, which is the district attorney's files. Again, if you don't know anything about the case and you're thrown into this cold, you'll get lost. You won't know who to believe because there's a lot of extraneous material in sorry, Boxie, but if you don't already know the case, it's easy to get lost because there's the Black Dahlia case it's a cast of thousands, lots and lots of names, and lots of details. It is really difficult to remember everything. And I can tell you that for a fact. It's really hard to remember everything. But I would recommend that rather than any of the books, even the magazine articles. If you were to spend a lot of money and let's say get a copy of True Detective from 1948, which is and I think that article is one of the first written about the Black Dahlia cases, because it also has, Jean French and all these other murders that are unrelated. You're going to get misinformed by that. So don't blow a lot of money on that unless you're into collecting old detective magazines. Go to the news stories. Really, that is the only way to do it. Why won't the new owners of the Sowden House let them dig up the basement? Why should they? Why should they do that? They have no investment in it. It's um, and they had. I think the closest they got was Buster the Cadaver Dog, cavorting around on the property of the Souden House, but there's nothing to find. I mean, the simple answer: there's nothing to find in the basement. So why should they let them do that? Um, the police file. Steve said the police files contain a picture of George Hodel and Elizabeth Short. That is absolute Steve Hodel bullshit. That doesn't exist. No, that absolutely does not exist anywhere. No, no. Again, you have to remember, Steve Hodel is a 24/7 bullshit factory. He will tell you things that absolutely are not true, and expect you to believe them. And again, given the choice between a truthful journalist, being me, and a lying cop, people will believe the lying cop every time. Absolutely every time. No, there is no such photo at all. Nope, doesn't exist. Let's see here. Getting close to the 10 o'clock or the 11 o'clock hour. Yeah, Buster the Cadaver Dog. Well, Buster is up in Cadaver Dog heaven at this point. He left the building, and what happened was there was a handler, Paul Dostie, and Paul Dostie and Buster got involved in looking out at. I can't remember the name of it. It's in Death Valley. It was the Manson family stuff, and they got out there, and Buster alerted on human remains and stuff, and of course they didn't find anything, of course, and so for a TV show, they had Buster and Paul Dostie. Buster ran around the Souden House and all that stuff, and that footage was not used for the original TV show. But they shot it. And so what happened is, I think that was like haunted houses or something like that. I can't keep all this stuff straight. Anyway, they came along and had footage of Buster the Cadaver Dog alerting on stuff. And so they had Buster alerting. Now, remember, you're dealing with a dog. You're dealing with an animal. Not to demean dogs. I love dogs, but any kind of dog that's trained to sniff, whether it's human remains or drugs or explosives or anything like that, you have to work with them constantly to keep them fresh, to keep their edge up. And I'm not really sure that was happening with Buster. It's kind of Buster got a lot of press because he's sort of the Jack the Ripper meets a cute animal story. Buster alerted on this stuff. And so they set off samples to, they have an enabler who was this mad scientist. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. And the samples were at this lab, so-called, for like a year, 2 years. I mean, Steve Hodel went on the radio with Paul Dostie, and they were saying, yeah, I don't think they're ever going to do the sample. Finally, the sample did get tested, and supposedly, yeah, right, exactly. And what happened was the Arpad Voss, is that his name? Something like that. Anyway, he said, yeah, it tested positive for human remains in the last like 20 to 100 years, and it's like, well, that's helpful, really. It was something fantastic, like, yeah, well, in the last 20 to 100 years, and it's like, oh, come on. But these folks who live on kind of the fringe, they all have radar for each other. Steve and Dostie and Arpad Voss, the mad scientist who tested, they have radar for each other. All these con artists have radar for each other, and they seek each other out. The guy I haven't mentioned, who I find incredibly entertaining, I call him Where is Luigi? There's a guy who and I'll wrap it up after this. There's a guy who calls himself Luigi Warren, and he is a big enabler of Steve, because Steve is terrible doing research. And so he's got this guy, Luigi Warren, who has gone back and attached George Hodel to this murder up in the Bay Area, another unsolved murder that that George Hodel did at the age of 13. As he was a teenage prodigy, he was a child prodigy serial killer, supposedly. And it's like, really? And you ask the basic questions. Okay, how did teenage George Hodel get up to the Bay Area to be involved in this murder? Well, they never answer that question. I mean, George Hodel in the world of Steve Hodel is this shape-shifting, pan-dimensional criminal genius who, if I need him to evil genius his way up to San Francisco, well, he's there. Or if I need him to evil genius his way to the Philippines, he's out in the Philippines. Or if I need to evil genius his way to Chicago to kill somebody, it's like, yeah, George Hodel will just evil genius his way there. Steve never lays any of the groundwork for any of this stuff. Like the murder of Suzanne Degnan, this unfortunate little girl in 1946. Well, Dad was probably on his way back to New York to go to China, and he stopped off in Chicago to commit a famous a famous wrongful conviction. Okay, Instagram, it is time for us to say goodbye. It's been wonderful. Catch you next time. Elizabeth Short on November 5th, next Tuesday. Okay. There. So, yeah, I mean, Steve doesn't bother with any of these technicalities like, can you prove that George Hodel was actually in the area at the time? No, he doesn't do that. I mean, it's just basic stuff that you would have to do. And the late Brian Carr said, if I came in with a case like Hodel's, I would get laughed out of the office. And on the final note, I will say, the LAPD has gone on the record saying there is no merit to any of the proposed solutions of the Black Dahlia case, including and especially George Hodel, serial killer and evil genius. And with that, we are up at the about the 11 o'clock hour. I think it is good to wrap it up here. The time has gone fast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being a little flexible. I wasn't sure when I was going to be able to do this for a number of reasons. But anyway, a couple of things. First of all, next Tuesday, Election Day, vote, but also ask me anything on ask me anything on the Black Dahlia, and I will be getting into this quite a bit. And finally, don't dress up like Elizabeth Short for Halloween. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't be the Black Dahlia. Just don't. You can be Harley Quinn. Be Mad Moxie. Be Boxie. Yeah, that would be great. Okay. Thanks again, everybody. See you next time. Again, don't dress up like Elizabeth Short. Don't dress up like the Black Dahlia for Halloween. Don't do it. Don't do it. Just say no. Okay. Bye-bye, gang.